It was a quiet morning in Hillside, Missouri on April 12, 2015, when the police received a 911 call from a frantic Darcy Baker. Her husband, Jaxon Reid Baker, had been found dead in their home. His body lay motionless on the kitchen floor, surrounded by signs of a struggle, and a pool of blood formed beneath him. Jaxon Reid, a successful real estate agent in the area, was well known in the community. His career had flourished, and his face could be seen on billboards advertising homes for sale across town. But behind the polished exterior, there were shadows in Jaxon's life that few knew about. It would take an investigation into his untimely death to uncover secrets that had been festering beneath the surface for months. When the first responders arrived at the Baker home, they were met with a gruesome scene. Jaxon, 48 years old and in his prime, had suffered multiple stab wounds to his chest. The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever committed the murder was either let in or had access to the home. Darcy, the woman who had placed the call, was in a state of shock, barely able to answer the detective's initial questions. She insisted that she had just found him after returning from running errands. Her voice trembled as she repeatedly denied any involvement, her words cutting through the still air of the crime scene. Detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett, seasoned investigators with the Hillside Police Department, took immediate charge of the case. Davis, known for her meticulous approach, and Bennett, with a background in behavioral analysis, quickly realized that this was no ordinary homicide. There were too many loose threads. The lack of forced entry, Darcy's scattered behavior, and the whispers of trouble in the Baker marriage were enough to raise suspicions. Jaxon Reid had been a man who appeared to have it all: a thriving real estate business, a beautiful home, and a picture-perfect family. He was married to Darcy Baker, an accountant at Razorback Accounting, and had taken on the role of stepfather to Darcy's daughter, Lucy Avery. Together, they projected an image of success and stability, but the cracks in their facade had begun to widen in the months leading up to Jackson's murder. As detectives interviewed those who knew Jaxon, a different picture began to emerge. Friends and colleagues described him as driven, sometimes to the point of being distant. His passion for sailing on nearby Beaver Lake was well known, but it also seemed to be an escape. The pressures of his marriage to Darcy, it seemed, had been taking a toll. Rumors of tension between Jaxon and Darcy started surfacing. Darcy, 42, had reportedly become withdrawn, and their once loving relationship had turned cold. Neighbors recalled heated arguments between the couple, and close friends speculated that their marriage was hanging by a thread. It didn't take long for investigators to zero in on Darcy as their first major suspect. She had been the one to find Jaxon, and her story didn't sit right with the detectives. There were inconsistencies in her account of the timeline. She initially claimed that she had been at home on the night of the murder, but when detectives pressed her during her interrogation on April 13, 2015, she faltered. Darcy later admitted that she hadn't been home the entire night but refused to elaborate on where she had gone. What really set off alarm bells for detectives Davis and Bennett was the discovery of an explosive piece of information. Darcy had recently found out about an affair. Not just any affair. Jaxon had been involved in a secret relationship with her own daughter, Lucy Avery. Lucy, 18 years old and a freshman psychology student at the University of Missouri, had been caught in the middle of a whirlwind of emotions. Outwardly, she was seen as bright and sociable, someone with a promising future ahead of her. But behind closed doors, she'd been carrying on a 6-month-long affair with her stepfather, Jaxon. The affair, once revealed to Darcy, had set off a chain reaction of emotional turmoil in the family. According to those close to the Bakers, Darcy had been devastated when she discovered the truth. Her daughter's betrayal, coupled with her husband's infidelity, pushed her into a dark emotional space. Darcy's friends described how she had become withdrawn in recent weeks, her behavior erratic, and her anger towards Jaxon palpable. Darcy's conflicting alibi, her recent discovery of the affair, and the depth of her emotional turmoil made her a prime suspect in the eyes of the police. Detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett were convinced that Darcy had the motive, but the evidence at that point was circumstantial. They needed something more concrete to tie her to the crime. On April 13, 2015, just a day after the murder, Darcy sat across from detectives Davis and Bennett in a cold interrogation room at the Hillside Police Department. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly as the detectives began their questioning. Darcy's initial calm demeanor quickly unraveled as the conversation shifted to the affair. "You knew about the affair between Jaxon and your daughter, didn't you, Darcy?" Detective Bennett asked, his eyes studying her closely. Darcy hesitated, her lips trembling before she finally nodded. "I found out recently Recently, she whispered. It destroyed me. And you confronted Jaxon about it? Davis pressed, her voice firm. Tears welled up in Darcy's eyes. Yes, I confronted him, but I didn't do this, she cried, her voice rising in desperation. I loved him. Despite everything, I couldn't have killed him. The detectives exchanged glances. Darcy's emotional state was raw, but they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she was letting on. Her inconsistent alibi and the fury she must have felt over the affair kept her under close scrutiny. But there was another angle to the case that investigators couldn't ignore. Lucy Avery, the stepdaughter tangled in this web of betrayal. On April 14, 2015, the spotlight shifted to Lucy Avery. She had been reluctant to speak with the police at first, but the mounting pressure from the investigation forced her hand. Lucy's relationship with Jaxon had been a secret, and now it was exposed for the world to see. During her interrogation, Lucy sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face, usually bright and full of energy, was now pale and drawn with worry. We know about the affair, Lucy, Detective Davis said, her tone gentle but probing. We need to understand your side of the story. Lucy glanced at the floor before speaking. It was wrong. I know that. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, but I didn't kill him. I couldn't. Her voice broke as she recounted the last time she had seen Jaxon. On the night of April 11th, 2015, just hours before his murder, Lucy had visited him. They had argued about the affair, about the toll it had taken on her mother, and the guilt that weighed on Lucy's conscience. We fought, Lucy admitted. I told him it had to stop, that it was tearing our family apart. He was angry, and so was I. Lucy's alibi seemed solid. She had been at a friend's house studying for a midterm exam on the night of the murder. Her friend corroborated her story, but the detectives couldn't ignore the emotional conflict Lucy was under. Had the argument pushed her to the brink? Could she have left her friend's house that night, gone to the Baker home, and committed the murder? The investigation was reaching a boiling point. Both Darcy and Lucy had motives. Darcy driven by betrayal and rage, Lucy by emotional turmoil and guilt. But with no definitive proof yet, the case remained wide open. The revelation of Lucy Avery's affair with Jaxon Reid Baker sent shockwaves through the community and deeply fractured the investigation. Hillside, Missouri was not a place accustomed to scandals of this magnitude. The local media descended on the small town, hungry for details about the love triangle that had led to the brutal murder of one of its most prominent citizens. As detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett continued their investigation, they couldn't ignore the complexity of Lucy's role in this tragedy. While her alibi seemed to hold up, the emotional weight of her relationship with Jaxon and the fallout it caused with her mother, Darcy, kept her in the spotlight. What was clear was that Lucy was not just a passive participant in the events that unfolded. She had been deeply affected by the affair, and the emotional turmoil within the family was still unraveling. When detectives questioned Lucy on April 14, 2015, the pressure on her was evident. The weight of her relationship with Jaxon, her stepfather, was a heavy burden to carry, especially now that it had been brought to light. What began as a secretive affair was now the focal point of a murder investigation, and Lucy's feelings of guilt and confusion permeated her every word. I never wanted any of this to happen, Lucy said, her voice trembling as she sat across from Detective Davis in the sterile, cold interrogation room. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You said you last saw Jaxon on the night of April 11th, Davis prompted, her eyes never leaving Lucy's face. Tell us exactly what happened. Lucy exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the table. We fought. He wanted to continue the relationship, but I told him it had to stop. I knew it was wrong, and I couldn't keep betraying my mom like that. The argument, as Lucy described it, was heated. Jaxon had been insistent that their relationship wasn't hurting anyone, but Lucy disagreed. She told detectives how she had stormed out of the house after telling Jaxon that they were over for good. I never saw him again after that, Lucy whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I swear, Lucy's testimony painted a picture of a young woman torn between two loyalties, the man she had become romantically involved with and the mother she had betrayed. Her relationship with Darcy had always been strained, but the affair with Jaxon had pushed it to the breaking point. As detectives interviewed friends and acquaintances, it became clear that Lucy had been struggling emotionally for some time. Her friends at the University of Missouri described her as outgoing, but prone to bouts of anxiety and withdrawal in the weeks leading up to the murder. It was evident that the affair was weighing heavily on her, and some speculated that the guilt might have driven her to extreme measures. But Lucy's alibi, a claim that she had been studying at a friend's house the night of the murder, was holding up. Her friend, a fellow psychology student, corroborated her story, providing a time-stamped text conversation that suggested Lucy had been there throughout the night. Despite this, detectives Davis and Bennett couldn't shake their suspicions. Lucy's emotional instability, her connection to the victim, and the sheer intensity of the argument she had with Jaxon just hours before his death left the door open for doubt. Meanwhile, the investigation into Darcy Baker was far from over. Detectives had already been honing in on her as the primary suspect, and her emotional state only strengthened their resolve. After all, she had been the one to discover her husband's infidelity with her own daughter, an unforgivable betrayal in the eyes of many. Darcy's behavior during the days following Jackson's death was erratic. Those closest to her described how she oscillated between grief and anger, often breaking down in tears and then lashing out in frustration. The detectives noted how this erratic behavior mirrored her conflicting statements during interrogation. It was as if Darcy didn't know what to feel, grief over losing her husband or fury over his betrayal. But was this emotional turmoil enough to push Darcy to murder? Detectives knew they needed more than just speculation. They needed solid evidence to tie her to the crime. Forensics had turned up nothing conclusive in the Baker home, and with both Darcy and Lucy maintaining their innocence, the investigation seemed to be stalling. That was until an unexpected breakthrough emerged. 5 days after Jackson's murder, on April 17, 2015, a jogger in Beaver Lake Park stumbled upon something suspicious. Near a park bench, just off one of the lesser-used jogging trails, the jogger noticed a partially buried plastic bag poking out from the dirt. Inside, they found a blood-stained shirt and a pair of gloves. Alarmed, the jogger immediately contacted the police. Forensic analysis revealed that the blood on the shirt matched Jaxon Reid Baker's DNA. But it was the gloves that truly captured the attention of investigators. Hair fibers found on the gloves matched Darcy Baker's DNA, and while the gloves themselves bore no fingerprints, they had traces of an unidentified third party. Additionally, surveillance footage from a gas station near Beaver Lake showed a figure resembling Lucy Avery entering the park late on the night of the murder. This discovery turned the investigation on its head. The evidence found near Beaver Lake linked Darcy to the crime scene, but it also introduced a new layer of suspicion surrounding Lucy. If Lucy had been at the park that night, what was she doing there? And why hadn't she mentioned it to the detectives during her interrogation? Detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett found themselves at a crossroads. The forensic evidence seemed to suggest that Darcy had been involved in the crime, perhaps directly or indirectly, but Lucy's possible presence at the park was impossible to ignore. Was she hiding something? On April 18, 2015, Lucy was brought back in for questioning. This time, the tone of the interrogation was far more direct. "We have reason to believe you were at Beaver Lake the night of your stepfather's murder," Detective Bennett said, placing photos of the surveillance footage in front of Lucy. Her face paled as she looked at the images. "That's not me," Lucy stammered, her hands shaking. "I wasn't there." The detectives pressed her harder, but Lucy held firm, insisting that she had no knowledge of the evidence found at the lake. However, her visible distress only added to the mounting suspicion. The investigators were beginning to wonder if Lucy had been more involved than she let on. As if the investigation wasn't complicated enough, another potential suspect emerged, Diane Baker, Jackson's ex-wife. Known for her hot temper and resentment toward Jackson's new life, Diane had never approved of his marriage to Darcy. And when the affair with Lucy came to light, it further fueled her anger. Diane's alibi on the night of the murder, claiming she had been at home watching TV, was shaky at best. She had no witnesses to verify her story, and despite a search of her home, detectives found no direct evidence linking her to the crime. But her volatile history with Jaxon, combined with her bitterness over his new life, kept her on the detectives' radar. With 3 suspects, Darcy, Lucy, and Diane, each with their own motives and ties to Jaxon, the case was teetering on the edge of a breakthrough. The discovery of the bloody shirt and gloves, coupled with the surveillance footage, had brought detectives closer than ever to solving the case, but questions still lingered. Had Darcy and Lucy conspired together to murder Jaxon in a fit of emotional turmoil? Was Diane somehow involved, seeking revenge on her ex-husband for his betrayal? Or was there an unknown element that had yet to be uncovered? As detectives continued to piece together the puzzle, the tension mounted. The small town of Hillside, once peaceful and unassuming, now found itself at the center of a murder investigation that seemed to uncover more questions than answers. With each passing day, the investigation into Jaxon Reid Baker's murder grew more complicated as new discoveries pushed the case into deeper, murkier waters. Detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett had been meticulous in piecing together the fragmented lives of Jackson's family and close circle. Yet something still wasn't adding up. The discovery at Beaver Lake, a bloody shirt, A pair of gloves and surveillance footage suggesting Lucy Avery's presence introduced new possibilities, but they also opened doors to more questions. Had Darcy Baker acted alone? Was Lucy more involved than she claimed? And where did Diane Baker, Jackson's fiery ex-wife, fit into the picture? As they sifted through the tangled web of lies, betrayals, and raw emotions, a new theory began to form. On April 21, 2015, Darcy Baker's life took a catastrophic turn. The surveillance footage of her blue Honda Civic driving toward Beaver Lake on the night of the murder, coupled with the forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene, was enough for the authorities to make their move. After a tense week of interrogations and mounting pressure, Darcy was arrested at her workplace, Razorback Accounting, where she worked as an accountant. Detective Bennett had been the one to break the news to her. "You're under arrest for the murder of Jaxon Reid Baker," Bennett said, his voice steady, but with a hint of weariness from the case that had consumed his life for weeks. Darcy's face went pale, her eyes darting between Bennett and the other officers present. "No, I didn't do this," she exclaimed, her voice cracking. She pulled away, her body shaking with fear and disbelief. "I didn't kill him. You've got it all wrong." But the evidence was damning. Darcy's conflicting alibi, the surveillance footage, and the forensic link to the gloves all pointed in one direction, toward her. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Darcy's consistent pleas of innocence raised doubts in some quarters. Could there be more to this story than the detectives had initially thought? Lucy Avery, reeling from her stepfather's death and the affair that had been laid bare before the public, struggled to maintain her composure. The young psychology student had tried to continue her studies at the University of Missouri, but the emotional toll of the investigation was becoming too much to bear. Her mother's arrest was a devastating blow. Despite the complicated relationship they shared, Lucy couldn't reconcile the image of her mother with the cold-blooded killer the authorities portrayed her as. On April 22, 2015, just one day after Darcy's arrest, Lucy was once again called in for questioning. This time, the detectives didn't hold back. "You're hiding something," Detective Davis said bluntly, her eyes locked on Lucy. "We know you were at Beaver Lake that night. The surveillance footage places you there." Lucy's hands were trembling, her usually composed demeanor slipping away. I wasn't there for what you think," she stammered. "I didn't kill him." "Then why didn't you tell us you were at the park?" Bennett pressed, leaning forward, his voice stern but measured. "Why lie?" Tears welled up in Lucy's eyes. She swallowed hard, her throat tight as she tried to find the words to explain herself. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I found the shirt. I found the gloves. I didn't know what they meant." Her confession sent shockwaves through the room. Lucy admitted that after her argument with Jaxon on the night of April 11th, she had gone to Beaver Lake, hoping to clear her head. She didn't expect to find anything suspicious, but when she stumbled upon the bloodied shirt and gloves hidden near the park bench, panic overtook her. Instead of reporting it to the authorities, Lucy had buried the items, hoping to distance herself from the growing chaos surrounding her stepfather's murder. "I was scared," Lucy cried, her voice trembling. "I knew if I said anything it would make me look guilty. I didn't want anyone to think I was involved." Her revelation was critical, but it also raised more questions. Had Lucy's actions been the result of panic, or was there more to her involvement in the crime than she was letting on? While the detectives focused heavily on Darcy and Lucy, Diane Baker, Jackson's ex-wife, continued to cast a dark shadow over the investigation. Diane had a well-known temper and a history of animosity toward Jaxon and his new family. With her alibi weak and her anger over Jackson's betrayal simmering beneath the surface, the detectives couldn't afford to ignore her. On April 24, 2015, Detectives Davis and Bennett visited Diane at her home for another round of questioning. Diane, ever the proud and defiant woman, greeted them with a cool indifference. "I already told you where I was that night," Diane said sharply, crossing her arms as she stood in her living room. "I didn't have anything to do with Jackson's death. I'm not shedding any tears over him, but I'm no murderer." But the detectives had found inconsistencies in her story. When asked about the specific episode of Dancing with the Stars she claimed to have watched, her description was vague and she couldn't recall any important details. They also noted how Diane's demeanor seemed more agitated this time. Perhaps the walls were closing in on her as well. "We need to ask again, Diane," Davis said, her voice calm but firm. "Do you have any knowledge of what happened to Jaxon that night?" Diane's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean? Are you accusing me of something?" The tension in the room was palpable. The detectives knew Diane had a motive, her long-standing resentment of Jackson's new marriage and the scandal of his affair with Lucy. But without concrete evidence, they couldn't pin anything directly on her. Yet the suspicion lingered, and they couldn't shake the feeling that Diane's role in this saga might not be as distant as she claimed. On July 15, 2015, Darcy Baker's trial for the murder of her husband began in the Washington County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed, the case having captured the attention of not only Hillside but also the national media, who were enthralled by the salacious details of the affair and the tragedy that followed. District Attorney Richard Matthews wasted no time painting Darcy as a woman driven to the edge by her husband's betrayal. The prosecution's case was built on the affair between Jaxon and Lucy, which they argued had pushed Darcy to commit murder in a fit of rage. Matthews presented the surveillance footage, the forensic evidence linking Darcy to the crime scene, and her conflicting statements as a clear narrative of guilt. "This is a case of a woman who felt her life crumbling around her," Matthews declared in his opening statement. "A woman who discovered the most painful of betrayals, a husband who was not only unfaithful but unfaithful with her own daughter. The evidence will show that Darcy Baker's actions that night were born of fury, resentment, and a desire for revenge." But Darcy's defense, led by attorney Vanessa Turner, was equally compelling. Turner argued that the evidence against Darcy was circumstantial, and she highlighted the holes in the prosecution's case. The defense focused on the lack of direct evidence tying Darcy to the murder weapon, and they raised the possibility that someone else, either Lucy or Diane, had committed the crime out of jealousy or anger. "Darcy Baker is not a killer," Turner insisted. "She is a woman who has been wronged, betrayed by the people closest to her. But she did not take her husband's life." The trial was grueling, with both sides calling multiple witnesses and presenting hours of forensic testimony. Darcy herself took the stand, her tearful testimony recounting the emotional torment of discovering Jaxon's affair with her daughter. She maintained her innocence, insisting that while she had been angry and heartbroken, she had never considered killing her husband. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. The tension in the courthouse was palpable as everyone waited for the final verdict. Would Darcy be convicted, or would she walk free? 3 days later, on August 3, 2015, the jury returned with their decision. The foreman stood, his face solemn as he read the verdict aloud. "We find the defendant, Darcy Baker, guilty of first-degree murder." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Darcy slumped in her seat, her face drained of color. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole by Judge Catherine Monroe. The verdict left many in Hillside shocked, but for others it was the closure they had been waiting for. With Darcy now behind bars, the Baker family was left to pick up the pieces. Lucy Avery, now 19, returned to the University of Missouri to continue her psychology studies, though the trauma of her stepfather's murder and the affair that preceded it haunted her. She sought counseling to cope with her guilt and grief, but the scars of that dark chapter in her life would never fully heal. Diane Baker, Jaxon's ex-wife, quietly retreated from the spotlight. Though she was never charged in connection with Jaxon's murder, her reputation in Hillside was forever tainted. She focused on rebuilding her life, but her bitterness toward Jaxon and his new family remained. As for the town of Hillside, the trial of Darcy Baker left an indelible mark. It was a reminder that even the quietest of places can harbor the darkest of secrets, and that beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives, turmoil and tragedy often lurk. Though the trial of Darcy Baker ended with a guilty verdict, the story of Jaxon Reid Baker's murder was far from over. Hillside, Missouri might have returned to its quiet, small-town existence, but the emotional and psychological aftermath left lasting scars on everyone involved. As Darcy began her life sentence in the cold isolation of prison, her family and the community wrestled with the haunting questions that remained unanswered. In the months following Darcy's conviction, Lucy Avery tried to resume a normal life, but normal was an illusion she couldn't grasp. Now a sophomore at the University of Missouri, Lucy immersed herself in her psychology studies, hoping to find some semblance of order in the chaotic world she had been thrust into. Yet her personal turmoil was inescapable. She often found herself consumed by guilt, not just over her stepfather's murder, but over the affair that had set everything in motion. Lucy knew that her relationship with Jaxon had been wrong, but at the time, she had convinced herself it was something more. A forbidden love that only they could understand. In the aftermath, however, she saw the truth for what it was: manipulation, betrayal, and confusion. Counseling helped Lucy to a degree, but her nightmares persisted. She often dreamed of that fateful night, reliving the heated argument she had with Jaxon before his murder. In her dreams, the confrontation always ended differently, sometimes with Jaxon leaving, other times with Lucy's hands around his throat. Waking from these nightmares left her with a cold sweat and the uneasy question, what if I had told someone sooner? Lucy confided to her therapist during one particularly hard session. What if I hadn't gotten involved with him at all? Maybe maybe none of this would have happened. Despite her mother's conviction, Lucy couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story. She had been at Beaver Lake that night. She had found the bloodied evidence. But was that all she had uncovered? She could barely recall her frantic state of mind at the time. Could she have missed something crucial in the panic? For Detective Megan Davis, Jaxon Reid's murder was a case that refused to stay in the past. She had been instrumental in Darcy's arrest, piecing together the evidence that ultimately secured the conviction. Yet, even as the media hailed her as a hero, Davis couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about the case was off. It wasn't that she doubted Darcy's involvement. After all, the evidence had clearly tied her to the crime scene, but the details surrounding Lucy's role in the case continued to trouble Davis. Why had Lucy buried the bloody evidence? Why hadn't she reported it immediately? And more disturbingly, was there a possibility that Darcy had taken the fall to protect her daughter? Davis spent countless sleepless nights poring over the case files, scrutinizing every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. She replayed Lucy's interrogation in her mind, focusing on the young woman's body language, her hesitations, her outbursts of emotion. Something about Lucy's reactions just didn't sit right with her. Despite the conviction, Davis felt compelled to visit Lucy at the University of Missouri several months after the trial, hoping to finally put her suspicions to rest. When she arrived, Lucy looked more fragile than ever, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights and stress. "I told you everything I know," Lucy said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I didn't kill him. My mom, she did it. You have the evidence. What more do you need?" But Detective Davis didn't flinch. "Maybe you didn't kill him," she replied softly. "But you're hiding something, Lucy. I just don't know what." Lucy's silence was deafening. Her eyes flickered as if she was fighting an internal battle, trying to decide whether to say more or keep her secrets buried. While Darcy Baker served her sentence, Diane Baker remained a free woman, though her reputation had taken a beating during the investigation. Hillside, ever the small town, was rife with gossip about Diane's possible involvement. The fiery ex-wife had never hidden her disdain for Jaxon or his marriage to Darcy, and some in the community believed she had more to do with his death than anyone would ever prove. Though Diane had been cleared of direct involvement, detectives had never completely ruled her out. She had motive, and her alibi was weak. After Darcy's conviction, Diane seemed to lay low, rarely seen in public, as if trying to avoid the accusatory glances of her neighbors. One night, over drinks with a close friend, Diane let slip what many had long suspected, that she still harbored intense resentment toward Jaxon, even years after their divorce. "He ruined everything," Diane said bitterly, staring into her glass of wine. "He took my life, my family, and turned it upside down. And then he went and did the same thing to Darcy and Lucy. Honestly, part of me feels like they all got what they deserve." Her friend, taken aback, asked if Diane had ever confronted Jaxon about the affair with Lucy. Diane chuckled darkly. "I didn't need to. That mess was going to come crashing down on them one way or another." Diane's cryptic words left many wondering if she had played a deeper role in the events surrounding Jackson's murder. Could she have manipulated the situation, pushing Darcy over the edge, knowing full well that Jackson's affair with Lucy would eventually destroy their family? Though the case was officially closed, Hillside would never be the same. Jaxon Reid Baker, once a successful and well-liked real estate agent, was now remembered more for the scandalous details of his personal life than for his professional achievements. His brutal murder, the affair with his stepdaughter, and the subsequent trial had cast a long shadow over the town. The Rotary Club held a memorial for Jaxon a year after his death, but attendance was sparse, and whispers of the affair lingered in the air. A plaque was installed in his honor at the Hillside Town Center, but few stopped to pay their respects. Jackson's name had become synonymous with tragedy and betrayal. Detectives Megan Davis and John Bennett both received commendations for their work in solving the case, but the resolution left a bitter taste. Bennett eventually transferred to the Northwest Missouri Drug Task Force, preferring the anonymity of his new role over the notoriety of Hillside's most infamous murder case. Davis, meanwhile, remained at the Hillside Police Department, though she often found herself replaying the investigation in her mind, wondering if she had missed something crucial. In the end, Jaxon Reid Baker's murder was a case defined by secrets that tore apart a family, a marriage, and a small-town community. Darcy Baker may have been convicted, but the true story of what happened on that fateful night might never fully come to light. Had Darcy acted alone, driven by the unbearable weight of betrayal and humiliation? Or had Lucy played a deeper role in her stepfather's demise, a role hidden beneath layers of guilt and grief? And what about Diane Baker? Had she merely been a bitter ex-wife on the sidelines? Or had her long-held animosity toward Jaxon pushed her to manipulate those around her into committing the ultimate act of vengeance? These questions would continue to haunt the town of Hillside for years to come, leaving everyone to wonder, how well do we truly know the people we love? And what dark secrets might they be hiding beneath the surface?